A few weeks ago, I was scrolling through my Twitter feed and came across a post that said something along the lines of, don't forget to use this time well, for after all, William Shakespeare wrote King Lear when quarantined for the plague, and Isaac Newton developed the theory of gravity and calculus whilst in quarantine too. And the intention obviously is to encourage us to use our time of isolation or lockdown in a way that's productive. And we've been thinking over the past few weeks about how we can use this time that we have at the moment when our regular schedules are up in the air and changed, when plans have been cancelled, and when regular activities are no longer taking place. And we looked last week at the importance of rest and how it's important to make the most of that if we have the time, but actually if perhaps we're busier than ever, to make sure actually that we're establishing times of rest as it's important. But this week I want us to think about actually making the most of this time in a way that's productive, not only for our own self physically and emotionally, but also for ourselves spiritually in our own Christian walk, but also for the church as well and encouraging those around us. So I want us to look a little bit at a passage in 2 Timothy and chapter 4. 2 Timothy is the second letter that the Apostle Paul has written to Timothy, his protege in the faith, his young pastor, and he's writing to encourage him. But in this letter, he's asking Timothy to come visit him. Paul is in prison in Rome. It's the last time he's imprisoned. He's likely going to be, we know he's going to be killed very, very shortly. But he writes to Timothy and asks him to bring a few things to him. And so this is where we find this in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 13. This is what it says. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all, the parchments. Paul asks for three items which reflect three different aspects of his life in isolation that he needs support with and wants to be able to continue with effectively. The first one is his own care of himself. As we said, it's getting near winter, and so Paul asks Timothy to bring him his cloak. A cloak was the item he'd have just to wear over the top of his clothes. It was a way of keeping him warm, of keeping him safe and healthy, and so he asked Timothy to bring it to him. It's getting near winter, it's going to get cold. The prisons didn't have central heating. They weren't particularly cared for particularly well in these Roman prisons. And so Paul is saying, can you just bring me this cloak because I'm going to need it? That shows us, doesn't it, actually the importance of making sure that during this time of lockdown, we are making the most of looking after ourselves and resting and also exercising and keeping ourselves well. Paul actually elsewhere in Timothy, in his first letter actually to Timothy in chapter 4 and verse 8, says this, bodily training is of some value, it's of good value, it's helpful. Paul recognised the need to look after his body, to keep himself well so he could continue to serve and do the things he needed to do. And each of us need to do the same during this time as well. But in this first letter of Timothy, Paul goes on to say, bodily training is of some value, yes, but godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. We need to be ensuring that actually our focus is not just on the now and the present, but obviously what is to come in the rest of our lives, but also, as Paul says, for what is to come. That is focusing not only on our physical well-being here and our interests here, but actually recognizing and investing in God's kingdom, in treasures in heaven, in investing our time in a way that's beneficial to us spiritually and our relationship to the Lord. And so he does this and expresses this in the two other items that he asks Timothy to bring him. The second one, actually, he says, is the books, also the books. These are most likely his scriptures, the Torah, his own copies he had of God's word at the time. And he says, bring them to me. I want to not only look after myself physically, but actually I want to grow in my knowledge of the Lord. I want to grow in my faithfulness. I want to grow in my righteousness. I want to grow in my faith. It's a really challenge, isn't it? You know, so often with the temptations that we have of our time to be used in different ways, we can be eager and willing to forsake perhaps growing in spiritual ways and in our Christian lives for the sake of entertainment or distraction. Actually, Paul is saying here, it's really important. I want to invest in this. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to go on after this time. I don't know if I'm even going to get out of lockdown, he says. But actually, I want to grow and continue to grow and continue to know my Lord more as time goes on. And so what we could be doing too during this time. Perhaps we have more opportunities to sit down in the evenings. Activities are cancelled and we're not going out as the way we used to. Perhaps instead of turning on the television and watching another series on Netflix or catching up on the latest daytime TV that we've missed, why not invest in God's Word? Why not spend time studying it more and spend time reading it more and spend time reading new books and developing in our faith, encouraging and growing in our prayer life and doing all of those things? What a shame it would be if actually we were to waste this opportunity that so many of us have got to grow in godliness and righteousness and our love for the Lord and our knowledge of Him, and wasting that time in a sense for just another episode of the latest series that we're watching. That's the second thing. But there's a third thing too. Paul says, and above all, the parchments. Now, parchments are most likely actually those apparatus that Paul used to use to write letters to the other churches. Whilst there he is in imprisonment and in lockdown, his world could be shrinking, but actually he's seeing it as an opportunity to encourage those around him. That's a great thing for us to be doing with our time too. With the added hours and moments we might have in our day, why not use it as a means of messaging those that we know and love and caring for them, for messaging fellow believers and encouraging them, writing letters, sending emails, sending texts, making phone calls, making video calls, interacting with people, writing a good old-fashioned letter to some people to encourage them. Paul sought to encourage people in their godliness and to equip the saints for ministry, whether he was in the church with them or whether he was in prison somewhere else. He wanted to invest in the kingdom and God's church and see it growing. 3 great ways for us to use our time productively for our physical health, for our spiritual growth, our spiritual lives, but also in investing in growing and encouraging the church to grow too. Why not get involved in whatever way you can to grow in godliness, to grow in your knowledge of God, and to seek the church to grow too. We're going to pray together in a few moments. Hopefully you can join us over the Zoom. If not, do use the prayer notes that would have been sent out with this video as well. Pray for your own spiritual life. Pray that God would help you to grow, would help you to see more of Him in His Word, would give you the excitement and desire to understand the great blessing that comes from knowing Him more and developing in our godliness too. Let's use this time well in a way that's productive. Let's rest, yes, but let's seek to use every moment we can for the glory of God, that His kingdom might come and His church might grow too.